Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's been 50 years since the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. There is no doubt that Robert F. Kennedy has taken on mythic proportions, indeed the aspirations of a generation, with the eloquence of his words. He swept to victory in the California presidential primary and told his supporters that it was on to Chicago, the Democratic National Convention. But in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel that night in 1968 ended dreams of many in the tumultuous years. It was also a year that saw the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the fevered pitch of the anti-war movement, and the election of Richard M. Nixon to the White House. Kennedy is quoted as saying once, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not." In our studio this morning is Michael Laughlin. He's a political science professor at Salisbury University. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
So what is your sense about that moment in time that you learned from? I don't know how old you were, but what sense you... And what were you doing when you learned about it, if you remember it?
Let's see. That has to be when I was still in high school, actually, I believe. And I grew up in a Catholic family, and my father was dead for quite some time, but my mother was an ardent Kennedy fan, I must say, and so that we were struck, as we had been as a family, with my 7 siblings actually, with the death of course, President Kennedy previously, and then essentially a kind of second blow, I think was what my family felt. And my politics, of course, had not developed much at that point. So I wasn't politically. I was more naive, I think, in terms of what the politics were. But certainly, as someone from a Catholic family, it was the aspirational character, I think, of Robert Kennedy was what struck us most. So it was quite a blow.
Mm. Yeah, because I remember, as a matter of fact, I remember watching television at the time, and Kennedy left the podium, and they were sort of babbling along, as it were, and then it came back on, and suddenly there it was.
The vivid picture of Kennedy on the floor being cradled by a staff member was so riveting, I think, in terms of the imagery. I mean, that strikes me most when I think about it now.
So one of the things that strikes me is that if we look back at Kennedy, there seems to be 2 RFKs. There's the one before his brother was assassinated, one afterwards. And in fact, in the early years, he was tied to Joe McCarthy and the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. I understand, by the way, that JFK actually opposed RFK being appointed as Attorney General, but the old man said, no, you have to do this. What sense do you get about this sort of bipolar, as it were, shift that seems to come with him?
I think it is striking because I think that we have to remember that Robert Kennedy had been, of course, a Cold Warrior, and he was involved with the disaster of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the like, but that I think as the Vietnam War emerged and raged on, in the Johnson period, and the tragedy of Lyndon Johnson himself moving towards embracing of a larger war there, that Kennedy, I think, began to see the fault in the flaws in that strategy, and there was a change, I think, in his character and his thinking about what needed to be done with the Vietnam War. But additionally, I think he was clearly struck by the civil rights movement. I mean, I think one of the dynamics that we social scientists are always wrestling with is what's the relationship between social movements on the one hand and leadership on the other. And I'm of the persuasion that it's the social movements that drive leadership or generate certain kinds of leadership at certain periods of time. And I think the tragedy of Robert Kennedy is that there were possibilities that he clearly was emerging as an inspirational leader. And there are some words I think we want to get to eventually to express that. And so that there were possibilities, and he began to see. But he was right. He emerged out of these movements: civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, even the environmentalist movement that were beginning to emerge as very powerful. And he was in part benefiting from that at that point in time.
Because, as a matter of fact, his comments, particularly as he was campaigning, have been described as, for the minority communities, as sort of bordering between Christ-like and celebrity. That is, he veered between preaching reconciliation, particularly racial reconciliation, but also then he switched to attacks on wealth and privilege and power, which, of course, is a certain irony in that, given the family that he came from.
Yeah, absolutely. If I may, one of the other pieces of this history I think that strikes me most is his oratory, and the particular passage I think that's most powerful, most poignant is of course with the assassination of Martin Luther King, and which had the possibilities of course, well, there were riots, of course, so he didn't stem all those, but his effort I think was striking when he said. And this is most striking in the context of what we have in a president today. I mean, the dramatic contrast. Here's what Kennedy said: "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom, and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black." And he went on further and he said we should dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world. I mean, the commentary there and the rhetoric there is so striking. The humanity, I think, and the inspirational character of bringing us together, again, in the striking contrast between a Robert Kennedy and a Donald Trump. We're lost in the wilderness today in comparison, I think, with these kinds of words.
Well, as a matter of fact, one of the interesting things is that at the time, Johnson, particularly in 1968, was seen as a very uncomplicated villain when it came to Vietnam. And yet, when we now look back, the things that are really noted about his efforts in the White House is economic equality, ending poverty, backing civil rights legislation, much to the detriment of the Democratic Party in the South. Did we underappreciate Johnson? Was it just the war that seemed to divide us so?
I think that's the truth. I absolutely, because it is. I mean, one of the ironies. I mean, in this respect, again, I think that we get a muddled view of matter when we think about Robert Kennedy somehow as opposing Johnson, that it was Robert Kennedy who was going to push forward on economic equality and the like. And again, that's the unknown question that we'll never get an answer to, of course, is that perhaps he would have. But he would have, if he would be doing that, he would have been carrying on the legacy of Lyndon Johnson, because it is Lyndon Johnson who brought us the war on poverty. It is Lyndon Johnson who soldiered through the '64 Civil Rights Act. It's Lyndon Johnson who accomplished the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is perhaps the most critical piece of legislation in the political history of the last half of the 20th century for the United States. So I think that is absolutely the case. And it should also be added that when you inquire further as to even Robert Kennedy's view on Vietnam, he clearly wanted to try to get out eventually, but he was no George McGovern. McGovern was once asked, well, how do we get out of Vietnam? And he said, in ships. Right, so he was like, you load the troops off and you're out of there. Whereas Robert Kennedy, his position at the time of his death actually was, we needed to stop the corruption in South Vietnam, and we needed to modernize further the South Vietnamese military. So Kennedy was not he was not really the hero of the anti-war movement at that point. In fact, if you look at the polling at that point in time, the anti-war folks were still aligned with Gene McCarthy, and there was a lot of rancor towards Robert Kennedy, as accusing him as being an opportunist, right, and perhaps destroying the possibility of opposing, pushing Johnson out of the race and the like.
So how do you compare the two men, Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy? And I understand that Kennedy obviously hesitated. Of course, McCarthy actually had a much better showing than anyone expected. He was the sitting president in New Hampshire. He didn't beat Johnson, but he had a much better showing. How do you compare the two?
I think Kennedy, I think, was more ultimately the heavyweight in terms, I think, across the spectrum of policy issues, whereas I think McCarthy, was essentially a single issue candidate for the most part. That it was really the war that he was most focused on, and trying to push on that issue primarily. So I think that in a 1-to-1 matchup, if that had taken place, I think we would have seen a greater depth of policy understanding and policy thinking with Robert Kennedy rather than with Gene McCarthy. Now, whether that would have led Kennedy to victory, I think, is really questionable, because even again at that point in time, Hubert Humphrey, who of course was the guy who finally gets the nomination for the Democrats, had the backing of most of the delegates going to the convention. Labor unions were largely in his camp. Now, whether that could have shifted, of course, that's one of the unknowables. But at least at that point in time, Kennedy was on fire, but whether that fire could have been put out in the further months, I think is quite possible.
Yeah, I think, as a matter of fact, there were only 15 states that actually had primaries. That they were really beauty contests and really didn't choose the delegates.
Yes, that's right. And so it's much it's almost apples and oranges in terms of comparing how the dynamic works in our present politics as opposed to the late 60s.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think that if Kennedy had won the nomination, do you think he would have won the presidency? I mean, it was very close with Humphrey. I think it was Nixon was like 43.4% and Humphrey was 42.7%.
If we can assume, let's try it this way. Kennedy was developing into an inspirational orator and leader, and the possibility, could he have been more powerful than, say, Hubert Humphrey in terms of his ability to rally and to generate enthusiasm? And we again, in political science, we focus now, as we talk about going into the midterms, the whole question is, are the Democrats going to be more enthusiastic and more fired up than the Republicans, right? And so intensity of interest, intensity and passion is an important factor. And the possibility, therefore, that it could be that one can make the argument, a plausible argument, that if Kennedy had been able to get all over the hurdles of getting the nomination, it's possible, certainly, that he could have beaten Richard Nixon, given that the closeness of the election itself.
So one of the things that was clearly happening was there was a great cultural divide, an explosion as it were, particularly during this period of time. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. And one of the observations was made was that Kennedy did really well when it came to minority communities, Hispanics, African American. On the other hand, when you look at the primary results, he didn't do so well with white working class voters, even though he did have an appeal to them. I mean, he was one of these candidates who seemed to be able to, at least on the surface, attract them all. I mean, do you think that he could have bridged that divide? Because at that point, there were white folks, particularly in the suburbs, who was looking at what was going on in the cities in particular, and saying, we don't want any of this.
Yes, yes.
I mean, I think about Chicago and the
Yeah.
housing and so on with Martin Luther King. I mean,
Yeah.
King, I think, said something about how he had never seen such hatred in the South as he did in Chicago.
Yeah. Well, I think if any candidate could have, Kennedy had that potential, I think, because he, I mean, many observers have said that there was part of the dynamic of his change, that he began to think more in terms of the question of economic inequality, wealth and income inequality. That began, as you may remember as well, that Martin Luther King, of course, began to turn to that question as well.
Right.
I mean, King was moving, of course, in the anti-war movement as war was beginning to think more along those lines, but also the economic question was becoming more prominent even at that point in time.
The People's March, I think, in Washington.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think Kennedy was moving in that direction as well. Again, I think it's a mistake to over radicalize Robert Kennedy because. I mean, some of his solutions were, we need somewhat less government. We need less taxes on businesses to get into the ghettos and so on. So they were more almost New Democrat, like Bill Clinton.
Right.
Yeah. There was so I think we don't want to misremember where he was at that point in time. But nonetheless, again, the times are dynamic, and the pressures, the movement pressures on someone like Kennedy, if he had been able to catch fire and really get the nomination, the possibility of him moving more leftward, I think, is there. I mean, again, it's his younger brother, right? Ted Kennedy
Right.
becomes the liberal lion of the Senate later, and I don't think that's unexplainable. So Robert Kennedy perhaps could have moved in that direction. So as an attempt to win over white working class voters, I think there certainly were potential. There clearly was potential there.
As a matter of fact, talking about Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, what do you make of his picking up the legacy? I mean, obviously we have the Chappaquiddick thing, which I guess at one point, at least I think it's been indicated that he recognized that, at least for the moment, any aspirations. In '72, for example, the presidency was gone. He eventually, of course, ran against Carter in 1980. How do you think he represents that legacy of the Kennedys in general, but also RFK in particular? I mean, he seems very moved. I mean, when at the funeral for his brother.
Well, the Catholic clan of the Kennedys, I think they were clearly a close-knit family, and perhaps unlike some families that break apart in diaspora almost, they clearly stuck together, and they were clearly public-minded and politically minded, and they loved being in the public arena and dedicated to that. And I think that Ted Kennedy picked up the mantle there. It was almost a fundamental burden as well. I mean, two of his brothers shot down in the public arena, and my sense is that he saw it almost as his familial obligation to carry forward their legacy and their promises. And again, as I said previously, I think movements generate leadership, and the two previous Kennedys came out and were part of those movements. And I think Ted Kennedy saw that he had an opportunity to pick up the baton and help move forward civil rights legislation, environmental questions, but then of course the healthcare issue becomes. I mean, again, we have to remember that the healthcare issue goes all the way back to Harry Truman.
That's right.
Yeah, and so that's always part in the background, certainly of the question of economic inequality, but also, I mean, Johnson, of course, with Medicare is quite important here, and I think Ted Kennedy saw an opportunity to carry forward on that. His relationship to his brother, to Bobby in particular, I think falls in the direction of the oldest brother, John, dead, right? Then that was I think it was a strong bond between Bobby Kennedy and Ted Kennedy, and again, that I think was certainly additional blow, but additional obligatory duty from Ted Kennedy to carry on the political legacy of his brother.
So, I mean, especially when Barack Obama ran in 2008, and Ted Kennedy, as a matter of fact, backed him over Hillary Clinton. And one of the things that struck me was that there was this comparison to the Kennedys. That I think was an observation that I had not seen anyone like that since certainly Jack, if not RFK. How do you compare those two? Because they were, I mean, all of them seem to have some inspirational quality to them. At least that's the common denominator.
One of the things I think always has to be remembered about some of these particular figures is that they carry forward an ability. They're inspired to be in politics in the first place, but they're also quite ambitious too. So ambition is very, very important here. I mean, I think Barack Obama was always just striking about Obama's ascendancy is the brevity of his previous political career, right? So
right.
he was in the Illinois legislature for a while. He did community organizing, and then he gets catapulted into the public and to national politics pretty quickly, and that's in part driven by ambition, but also a strong, powerful social movement that's propelling him as well. So I think that we see these kinds of figures, and I think we can easily predict that we're going to see this in the future too. These kinds of figures emerging as well. I can't put my finger on who that would be presently.
Right.
Right. I don't know. Maybe Bernie Sanders is a kind of part of that. I don't know if he has quite the kind of mesmerizing quality as someone like Barack Obama or in this case Robert Kennedy.
So how do you compare the two periods? And are we living as a result? In some ways, I've always get this sense we're living as a result of the battles that exploded in the 1960s that Robert F. Kennedy sort of oversaw during his time. That those conflicts are still with us, although they've morphed into a different fashion as we've seen, particularly, and maybe become a bit more extreme in recent years because of the potential demographic change that's taking place.
I think that's absolutely true, and what I would suggest is that the legacy of the civil rights movement we can see in Black Lives Matter. The legacy of the women's movement we can see in hashtag #MeToo, and that has generated. The Trump presidency, what the Trump presidency represents, Trumpism represents, is of course the backlash, the reaction, the reactionary movement to these quite powerful movements that continue to propel our society. And again, I think the history of social movements is they tend to ebb and flow. They rise and crest and are quite powerfully visible at certain points in time, and then perhaps recede and have face defeats. I mean, I think clearly the Trump presidency represents a defeat. That the social movements were insufficiently powerful to overcome Trumpism in the past election. But that doesn't mean they've gone away. Indeed, again, I think it's possible. Let me try it this way: if Democrats actually have some kind of a blue wave in the fall, that is going to be because of the civil rights movement and the women's movement, and those kinds of movements that are going to provide the enthusiasm for turnout in the fall election.
We were speaking with Professor Michael Laughlin, a political science professor at Salisbury University, talking about the 50th anniversary assassination of Robert F. Kennedy and its implications. I appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
Thanks so much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.